So with the bong announcing as always the end of our brief brief break, I'm really happy to welcome for the fifth time. So Sonja Stojanovic-Gajic, who's been with us in all the School for Thinktankers that we've had. So 4 times in Geneva and first time online. And Sonja will be the first one to deliver the sessions on finance and fundraising. Sonja is the founder and leader of Public Engagement, the consultancy for advice on public engagements in security policy, conflict transformation, and EU integration, and for the research supporting it. She's an experienced researcher of security, governance, and conflict transformation, and an organizational consultant. From 2006 to 2019, she led the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, BCSP, as its director, during which she helped it transform from an advocacy NGO into a think tank specialized in public oversight of security sector. Sonja has a PhD in international relations from the University of Belgrade and an MA in politics, security, and integration from the University College London. She taught security studies part-time at the Faculty of Political Science in Belgrade and published on policing, peace building, EU, and gender. Sonja initiated a number of national and regional civil society partnerships and multi-stakeholder platforms to address some of the key challenges in the Balkans, such as deterioration of democracy and democratic governance of security, normalization of Belgrade-Pristina relations, and accession to the EU. Sonja has an extensive experience, more than 20 years of experience as a facilitator and trainer with diverse groups, including public servants, MPs, security professionals, civil society, international organizations from Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Middle East. As an organizational consultant, she has assisted both civil society and public administration in the Balkans with strategic planning, change management, and advocacy. And she's always a delight to have around. And she is probably well known to our colleagues from BCSP. I don't know, Sonja, if you know, but we have 4 colleagues from BCSP joining us. So welcome to the school. Welcome to the School for Thinktankers, and I'll let you start the presentation now.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. It's really a great privilege and fortune to be with you again. And I'm especially happy this year that there are more of my colleagues from Belgrade Center for Security Policy, who I'm sure you have met in the last couple of days. I want to ask you before we start the session to just give me the temperature in your room at this moment in a chat. If you can write just one word on how you feel, and don't censor yourself, whatever comes to your mind first, just for me to know where you are. Are you ready for talking about finance, or are you tired? Do you have Zoom fatigue? Whatever it's on your mind. So hungry, I see Boyan saying, finishing up my lunch. That's honest. So I'll excuse you from turning on your camera. Anyone else who missed the meal or drink or stretching the legs? Curious, thank you. Scared to talk about finance as a non-finance person. Welcome to club, Teresa. Marcel, ready to go. 18 degrees, just had my coffee. Good, Pampia. Expectant, fantastic. Okay, multitasking. I understand you're working and it's a weekday. Hopefully you'll be able to tune in and in the session and at least note down the questions you might have so you can ask me. 28 degrees and hot. Excited to talk about finance. That's a good thing when somebody is excited about finance. Second coffee. Okay, so we need some doping. Keen to listen. I'm sure everybody has here something to share. Colombian coffee. I envy Carlos for this. So anyone else on where you are on a topic and at this point of the day? You can write down in the chat. What I'll ask you to do is to feel free to interrupt me during the session at any point. If you have a question or a comment or example that you want to share, or a challenge you want us to think about. I have shared with Andrea, and she shared with you a tool for assessment of financial health of a think tank that I have built through years of experience of exposure to different audits and reviews by different donor organizations. And this is usually something I would do at the beginning of the workshop if we would have more time. But since there is a limit in time and we're working online, I'll ask you to fill it in maybe after the session and keep it as a kind of tool to build your capacity. What I've planned to do today is following. I'll share the presentation. Sorry. So as the topic says, my focus is on finance for non-finance people. So I don't have any background in finance. My educational background is, as you heard, in social sciences. I have a long civil society activist experience, and most of my learning has been through doing or through practice, including through learning on mistakes. And I'm willing to share with you some of these mistakes and learning so that fortunately you don't need to repeat them, but can learn on them. So what I plan to cover are two topics. Please let me know if you don't see the screen properly. And you can use the hand or other functions in Zoom to react, and Andrea will monitor your reactions. So there are two topics that I want to cover today. First one, the major one, is just the basics of financial management and leadership in old normal when I was leading an organization. So what are the kind of basic skills or concepts that we should be familiar with when thinking about the financial health of a think tank? Much of this knowledge is not unique for a think tank. It's common with most of nonprofit organizations. And it, although it uses some of the fancy terms like cash inflow, growth, costs, so on, business, funding model, it's really about the basic logic on doing what you want to do with the right resources and a right kind of support. The other topic that I hope we will cover is how to run finance in a time of crisis. And I don't mean just COVID crisis, but broader crisis of less predictable funding by donors globally, and also more polarized and more restrictive space for civil society engagement. So broader trend than just the last 2 years of a shock caused by COVID. But before I proceed, I just want to ask if anyone would have an association of why I've put financial management and financial leadership as the two different functions in an organization. Any ideas from the group? Who would do financial management in a think tank, and who is in charge of financial leadership?
Well, I guess leader is the one who gives some guidelines, sets priorities, and makes big decision making, how can I say, while manager is someone who is equipped with all the financial knowledge to do their task.
Thank you, Jelena. So financial management is for more specialized person who is taking care of day-to-day finances, monitors the spending, the planning, while the leadership has, as you said, a more of prioritizing role. I have seen someone else also raise a hand, and I've lost the person now on the screen. So if the person wants to add, I think
yes. Eduardo.
Please, Eduardo.
From Mexico. Yes, I was thinking financial leadership, the one that is very connected as well with executive director or board of directors to see what is the financial assets for. I mean, you can ask a lot, but what do you want to do, and what is your main goal? This has to be connected with leadership of the whole organization.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much, Eduardo. So as you and Jelena said, the financial leadership or the financer's role, the leader's role is to make sure that finances are used and collected for the right purpose, so that organization can fulfill its mission. So it's related to the bigger picture than just how much we have on account and what are the revenues. The leader or CEO, the board have to take care also of this financial data, but they are using it as an information for planning and for harmonizing what the organization does with what it wants to achieve. While financial manager is a technical person or an expert in that area that runs the finances on everyday basis and monitors and helps the leaders make a decision. I can't check the chat, but if there are any relevant comments, I can ask Andrea to read it out.
There's some comments on, so it's the accounting finance department said Ognachi. Enrique said financial management could be the accountant, but leaders might be CFO or the ED. And Ramu said that leadership is the executive director.
Okay, so now we have a clear idea who is doing what. Enrique was using abbreviation, so the big organizations might have a chief financial officer, a kind of fancy terminology from business. But the smaller nonprofits and think tanks might have only one or half a person dealing with finance matters, and they might be in charge of financial management on day-to-day and might work with an external accountant. So the functions might be distributed. But for me, what's important to understand is just the different focus of leadership and management. Okay, so as I've said, to be true about what I can share or not share with you is to say that I have never had proper training in management. I've started the work in a think tank as a researcher. So my role was asked to take a management position, but I kept both the programmatic and the management responsibilities, which is, I would say, too much for one person. But I have experience from both sides. What I've learned is through practice and through taking part in communities like on Think Tank community and also the regional directors community of think tanks in the Western Balkans that existed for a few years. And I've learned also from reading and self-education and also learning on mistakes and discussions within our team. And I want to share some of these mistakes with you today. And the images here are to show the most prestigious award I've received for my contribution to a program, to a topic of security sector reform, and my favorite award, which was a song or a poem written by a team when I was leaving the organization, saying that I was half woman, half reform. And I'm happy now that I can be more of a woman and less of reform and be able to share with you these lessons from that period. So you have probably got to know BCSP from my colleagues by now. But what I want to contextualize for this session that is important for you to know is that the organization has a very unique mission for security think tanks. So most of Western security think tanks focus on high politics, on foreign policy, on providing security out there, while Belgrade Center for Security Policy is focused on accountability at home. So in its mission, it's almost similar to a watchdog organization. It's not a typical think tank by the focus of its work. It's one of the bigger organizations in our region, although, as you have probably read in on Think Tank's first report on the think tanks globally, our region has one of the smaller budgets worldwide. And you can see the progress of the budget increase over years in our case. Why I'm showing these numbers is to share the first lesson that I've learned, and this is that growth is not necessarily always positive. So as you can see, we have growth quite significantly over the years. Almost at some point, as you can see, 2011, 2014, it was almost 100,000 euros a year, quite a significant increase. But that was very difficult to follow with the organizational capacity, and also why the growth was not good, because the structure of the budget at that time was not good for us in organization. And I'm going to explain why in a minute. And if you have a question, feel free to jump in. So this is the promise. And now I'll start with a more of kind of lecture before I illustrate it with BCSP experience. So the concepts that I'm sharing with you now, when I started, I didn't know them. I haven't learned them. I was doing it by, using the brains and thinking and discussing with colleagues. And only later on, I realized that these practices have a name and that there are some lessons learned that are common for different organizations. So these are the concepts I want to discuss. And these are business model of an organization and a funding model of organization. So how do we make a change? How do we influence policy? Who are we working for? With what kind of resources? And then what kind of financial resources we need to make it happen? So this is the first concept. And then I want to discuss the pros and cons of different sources of funding and how the environment, both the policy and funding environment, influences the decisions, and what are the implications, again, about the good practices and mistakes that I've made during this experience. So first point is that finances can never be thought about separately from the bigger organizational sustainability. So financial sustainability is only a component in a puzzle of a good health of organization, and you can have tons of money and they can be from different sources, but if they don't support what you want to achieve and your strategic goals, or if they cost you too much in the sense of effort you invest, or how they influence your image as an organization and identity, then you are not successful really. So financial sustainability has to be always taken into consideration with other aspects of the governance of the organization. And this is, I would say, the biggest part of the lecture is these two concepts that I've explained that I wasn't familiar of, but that we practiced by instinct. And these are the business model and funding model. So as we've said, the organizational leaders are in charge of business model. They need to, together with the team, decide what is it that organization is providing in a unique way, how it is providing, and how it is going to make to influence policy and groups that it has decided, and keep the reputation. So it is about type of activities. It's about what are the goals that we want to achieve, or the policy changes, and it should include everyone in organization in a discussion. The funding model, it's about how do we support these goals. So what kind of combination of funding we want to use for what type of costs. And I'm sure that some of you have had an experience in your life with monitoring budgets. And all of us policy wonks love to say to our governments that reading a budget statement is actually reading the commitment to a strategy that government wants to implement. So it's the same for think tanks. The funding model should support your business model, should support your strategic goals, both by what kind of resources you draw, what resources or funding you refuse and don't want to take, and for what kind of costs. So if we say, for example, we are making change through a partnership and consultation and brokerage with government agencies, then our funding model should include a lot of costs for this type of activities, meetings, reviews, different kinds of engagements with government, and not just, for example, research and outreach to general public. And it might therefore also influence the choices in your funding model on who are the funders that would make it acceptable for government to talk to you, and who are the funders that would deter government from engaging with you. So, for example, a good example I've heard of, actually from colleagues from Latin America years ago, who were engaged as a think tankers in opening discussions around elections in Argentina, Peru. They were saying that it was very important in order to engage different political parties not to be supported by donors that are kind of unacceptable to political parties and general public, like USAID or World Bank, and to have a pool of donors that would support this engagement, so to be able to preserve impartiality position. So this would be in a relationship between a business and a funding model. I'll skip these examples, you'll get the presentation. What I want to highlight is this is all nice and theory is, good, but then we come to the earth, to specific country, to specific place where you operate, and there you need to look at the context, which influences your choices and what you can do. It influences who you can ask funds from, what is available out there, how much there is demand for your topic, and also what are the trade-offs that you're willing to make not to compromise your mission. And I wanted to give you an example of BCSP here. You won't be able to see, okay. Is it visible now? Can I get some hands raised? Or yeah, okay, good. Okay. So this is not a part of the session, learn everything you wanted to learn about BCSP and, we'll test you at the end of the session. It's more to illustrate this point about the business and funding model. So, and how the context has influenced it. So the organization, as I said, was the first in our region to start the topic of democratic control of police, army, at that time, intelligence, and so on. And it was initiated by two retired military officers who left the Yugoslav People Army for disagreement on how it was used during the conflicts in the 90s. And they didn't have any funds initially. They were really like an activist, just changing the discourse about the topic and opening the debate. So their funding model at that time was no money, no trouble. Everything they did during the authoritarian part of political life of our country was with the support of other friendly NGOs. But they were at that time more acting as an activist NGO, no money, and just opening a debate. After the democratic transition, the peaceful revolution, there was a huge opening and demand for their expertise, and being the first one and not having a competition made it easier, because donors were coming to their doors, knocking and asking how much money they need, what ideas they might have. So it was kind of a golden area of development organization. And I've seen the similar things a few years ago when I was working in Armenia. after a revolution, donors were looking for anyone who could implement and so that they can say at home, we have invested, we have supported, democratized Armenia. So at that time, there is a big demand, so it's easy kind of to fulfill, to create a funding model. But our founders were very clever to start professionalizing and focusing on research. And they actually started the work that I continued with, transforming an NGO into a think tank. So putting an emphasis on research stuff, on research products, on evidence and policy engagement. And at that time, organization was already helping create a new kind of elite that speaks the language of security, both through work at the university, but also educating other NGOs, journalists, and so on. So in a way, BCSP has created its own competition, because many of the people, our founders, have trained and educated, have started their own organizations. And also in Serbia, because security institutions were a problem at home and were repressive towards domestic population, there was a big demand for this kind of discussions. So in this period, we were very happy that we were able to do a transformation due to institutional funding, together with project funding. So when I came to BCSP, or it was called Center for Civil Military Relations at that time, the organization had almost 80% of its funding from one donor through a so-called core grant that covered all the basic costs, the office, the salaries, even the career development, very rich and diverse career development program for research staff, as well as a kind of pilot initiatives, innovative initiatives that we were working on. And the program was funded in 2 cycles of 3 years and decreased, but we were clever enough to start applying for projects immediately, so not to rely only on this one donor. And also this is a funding that was used to build institutional capacity. So procedures, to put procedures in place to get the specialized functions. So instead of one, to have 2 persons in finance, and also to approach other donors. And then the next 2 periods, I would say I'm most proud of this period until 2015, when we were able to phase out the core support and to completely go to the market and get funds from a variety of donors. That has requested building up capacity not only of the finance persons, but also of the program staff. So the researchers also received training in writing projects and were involved in this process. And we have also advanced our practices by institutionalizing, for example, organizational audit. So before that, we would have auditors review bigger grants when donors requested it. But since that time, we've did the audit of the whole of our organizational budget, whether or not donors requested it. And that has been received as a sign of strength of organization. And it made us eligible for bigger funds, for multi-annual funds, for regional funds and regional programs. So if I would suggest to someone starting an organization is to think of as early as possible to be able to have also a financial audit of the whole budget of the organization, because it shows also part of your financial health. Business model at that stage, because everything was kind of going okay, was that we worked in partnership with government, and we could work regionally. So just by being financially healthy and having all these opportunities, you could actually diversify funds and could relatively easy, without compromising your mission, implement the business model. Since
Sorry,
the political
Sonia.
situation, yes.
There's a question by Donia. If you said to interrupt you, so sorry.
Sure.
I'm very sorry. It's because it's on the previous slide, and it's just sometimes I get confused when we talk about institutional funding. Is it the same thing as core funding? Because words are important, right? Just to make sure, there's so many different types of fundings. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly.
Yes, you are understanding correctly, Donia. So it's a fund, unrestricted funds that you receive by donor for your core business. So it's to implement your mission, and you can spend it on a variety of types of costs. So administrative cost, the program cost, you can spend it also on investment and capacity building. So it's not for a specific project. It's not for to implement a specific program. It is support to the organization as such.
Thank you very much. All clear.
Okay. Thank you very much for clarifying question. Is there anyone here who has a core funding at this moment? You can speak in camera.
Yes, Eduardo. Yes, we have a small core funding actually from since last year, and we're more or less see your process. I reflected the process that we have in Causa Natura in Mexico right now. We started like an advocacy organization, and we are getting more and more as a think tank. Even though we started like this idea of being an advocacy NGO that works environmental issues.
Mm-hmm. Good. Anyone else that has core funding, this privilege, the institutional funding? No, hello? I think there are very few donors. Donald, do you want to speak? Yeah.
Yes. No, we do not have core funding. We are currently in the organization of project funding. But my question is just to ask you why in 2012 and 2015 you tried to phase out the institutional support. I don't know. You understand why?
Partially it's our choice and partially it's not. So the good donors that provide institutional support, they usually don't give you the same amount of money every year, but they want you to see that you grow and they decrease. So if, for example, in a year one, they cover 100% of your budget, in a year two, they will tell you, we will cover 80%, in year three, 60%, and so on. Partially because we, as I've said, didn't allow that even when we had 100% budget covered to rely only on one donor. So we start approaching other donors with initially smaller grants, but in order to build relationships and also to build kind of our profile so that later on we could get more funds from them and we would be ready for the market. So for the market competition. So as I said, it's a combination of both the pressure by the institutional supporter and our kind of learning that we need to be ready. Because if you wait until the moment you are on the market, you are too late. You are not going to be ready. And I'll just give one specific example. We had support from Think Tank Fund, from Open Society, and they were paying 100% of communications officer salary, which allow us to introduce this function, which we didn't have at that time in organization. But after year one, director of the fund with whom I relied would ask me, why aren't you asking other donors to support this function? And I've said, but we have it covered 100%. But he said, you should, educate the donors by putting this budget line in a budget so that when we are out, they are ready to support this function. So this is what we did. The next year, we asked 10 or 20% of a salary of communications officer from other donors and asked for shifting that funding within the institutional core for other purposes. So in a way, you're also educating your donors what they should support you with, how or what is your funding model that supports your strategy and your business model.
Yes. Can I still ask a question?
Sure.
No, I thank you for the clarification. And before starting, I mean, in my understanding, what I think and I thought having also a co-funding, of course, that will not represent a bigger part of your funding of your fund, but having a co-funding also important in leading a think tank. Right? Am I wrong thinking that?
I'm not sure I understood the question. So
having a core funding, is it good or bad to have a core funding? Although it is not, I agree with you that you are not on a safe side if the core funding represent your main, I would say represent a bigger part of your funding. But having a core funding is always useful because then you are not on a project base and you need also to do some activities related to your mission. So from my perspective, is bringing the core funding to 0%, is it a good strategy?
I think it's brilliant if you can have core funding because that allows you more flexibility and you can experiment. So, for example, we've invested in building an index of accountability of security institutions over the course of 3 years, and that was possible because we had a core funding. So we could experiment and invest in innovation. And it's also good as a kind of safety net if there are problems with other unexpected problems with other types of funding. But it's very difficult to get, and less donors are giving this kind of support, especially in our part of the world. Yes, Andrea.
There's some questions in the chat box that I'm going to read. So we have from Mere, who's in Fiji. We're fully funded by the Australian government, like the EU in your context. Australia is the biggest, closely shadowed by China, and most cumbersome donor in the Pacific. Then we have a question by Sophie, a comment. Sophie's in Brussels, saying that what is interesting is where the core funding comes from. In Germany, it is seen positively to receive funding from the government with parliamentary approval, while in other countries, the UK, for instance, this would be seen as lacking independence. And finally, a question for Mere on her budget is nothing. They answered each other.
Okay, thanks for these comments. I agree 100% on this comment that what is appropriate funding depends on context. And the only advice for a colleague from Fiji is great that you have a core support, but you know, be ready that Australia's foreign policy might change, and it doesn't have to dramatically change, but just enough that they decide to, for example, cut a percentage of their development aid. Could create an earthquake in the regions where civil society depend on Australia as a primary or the only source of funding. So my advice would be to, even if you are safe, and especially now that you are safe, invest in getting some other sources and building relationships with other donors. So if you get in a position that you need to get other types of funding, you will be ready. May I proceed? Okay. So the difficult part of our work is when the political situation worsened and the donors were late to understand it. So they were still, for example, insisting on partnerships with government, while the division between civil society and government deepened. And also the polarization in society has deepened, and there is a negative image of civil society in general. But there is also bigger competition because there are now more actors than just think tanks dealing with security and the type of issues that BCSP has been dealing with. And we have try to diversify the funds and to have a different sources of funding to survive in this environment. And I'll illustrate this in more detail in a minute. Yes, the most important part of this is that because of political change, our focus changed again on defending democracy. So that also influenced which donors are kind of ready to support this and which are not, and also who our partners and type of activities are going to be. Okay, so this is from the background material you have received. These are different types of funding. I think you have discussed them. I'm sorry you don't, okay, see them well. So these are different possible sources of funding. So we've discussed now institutional funding. I guess most of us lives from grants and project funding. Is there anyone here who has a corporate or business funding for their organization here?
Hi. Actually, I don't even have an organization yet, as I'm thinking, I'm in the process of creating a think tank, but corporate funding, or I mean rather private sector funding, is something I'm keeping in mind, because where I come from in Tunisia, I mean, the state is broke, it's a fact, and international money is very delicate because it's kind of, you know, there's in its context, it's not well seen to have money from abroad because, you know, it's interference, you know, it's interference, it's like, you know. So I'm looking at the private sector, and then I'm thinking, okay, private sector, it can also mean lobbies and people directing, you know. So in any case, it's always difficult. But just bear with me a split second. I'm thinking of trying to get this money, but putting it into an endowment so that would bring money, and keep it all very transparent. So this is my thinking. What is your thought on the private sector, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Donia. I think your logic is quite very good. We don't have much experience with private funding because it was difficult in relation to our topic. So our first contacts with the business was in relation to research on private security back in 2007, where we actually helped the private security companies become part of national security community. And some of them have offered us funds, but we've decided not to receive them because we thought that it would endanger our mission of also analyzing their accountability and not just government's accountability. However, there are a number of think tanks that receive corporate funding, and they have put in place different safeguards to save their own independence. So, for example, they have a very clear membership guidelines if the corporate entities are their members, what they get for the membership. So they get, for example, participation in events, consultations, but they might be even consulted on topics that should be priority. But the research team and the organization decides which of these topics to pursue and how, and the corporates cannot influence the conclusions. And I think these are the principles that should be valid for any type of donors if you want to protect your independence. But I would advise that you ask this to my colleagues who will be with you, I think, tomorrow, the day after, because they have way more experience with corporate funding than me. I think Milena in Colombia, her organization is very much working with the business sector, and also Bruegel is an economic think tank that has major companies as its members. So I think they will be really good speakers on this topic. I've seen Teresa raising her hand. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, a question. Sorry, my name is Teresa, apologies, and I work for the European Council on Foreign Relations in the Italian office. With the corporate fundraising, at least in Italy, which is a very peculiar country in terms of funding for think tanks, because we don't have that strong think tank tradition apart from major think tanks like IAI or ISPI. We experienced a very interesting trend with corporate funding. After the financial crisis, there was a crisis of corporate funding because big companies realized that they have spent a lot of money on activities they cannot support anymore. So they needed to cut. And this is why in Italy, we have experienced a reorientation towards other kind of funding. Also the public one, which is very difficult, especially in terms of reporting and all the requirements you need to have to apply for that money. What was interesting to see with COVID, I think everybody was very scared at the beginning of the pandemic about the consequences of COVID on funding, is that Italian companies are now back to fund again. Why this? Because they found themselves in the middle of 2020 with a lot of money allocated to their departments. And as we all know, if a department in a company does not spend the money allocated, the year after, it's not getting that money anymore. So we were very surprised to see that a lot of Italian companies asked to fund not only us, but other think tanks. So it was really an interesting process, a reverse process provoked by the pandemic. And even more interesting, it will be to see how in 2021 or 2022, we as Think Tanker, we will be able to secure that funding to be continued.
Thank you very much for this example. It's a way better situation than, for example, in UK, where I read that the major NGOs dealing with the development gathered around the bond organization. 48%, so almost half of them, estimated that they wouldn't exist in 2 years' time. They were afraid that their funding will disappear and they won't be able to perform their functions. So it really depends on the context and the strategies of different companies. I also heard from colleagues in Brussels, for example, after the 2008 economic crisis, that their corporate membership has significantly decreased because it was paid from marketing budgets, and marketing budgets were the first to be cut at the economic crisis. So for example, colleagues in European Policy Center said that at one moment they had 2 million euros less, so like 50% less, and they've committed to buying a property, a new building. So they were in a great trouble at that moment. But my point is that none of the sources is 100% safe and reliable, and that's why we usually aim to have variety of sources and diversity, and we always have to take care, as Donia has said, how it affects our mission and policy influence. So I'll skip this part. You will find pros and cons on different organizations. I just wanted to illustrate again how complex context influences work. So there are two types of context that you should analyze. One is the policy environment and the other one is funding environment. So policy environment, it's whether there is demand for your topic, and also whether there is demand also among donors for your topic. So what we have faced, as I've showed in a previous slides, is after the democratic revolution, there was a big demand both by donors and by the population and by politicians for a topic of how to put army, police, intelligence under control. In later years, as it was perceived that democratization was on right track, it became less sexy. And for example, in many of the calls, we had to think of how to present our topic of security along with other burning issues like poverty or corruption. So what we did was not to shift the focus of the organization, but to look for example, the linkages between security governance and corruption. And we build profiling in this area. Also, what we have seen, and I think this is common for many countries, is that many of the topics we cover are in demand by media, but they are not interested in the issues that we care about, but more into day-to-day reaction to everyday events. But anyway, your media presence helps with fundraising, because it's not a small number of times that I heard from donors a question or inquiry about our work from seeing us in media or following our work on social media. Funding environment, main funding, unfortunately, is still from foreign funding. It's being delegitimized, similarly to what we heard from Colin from Tunisia. And the biggest donor is EU, which is nice, but also challenging. And I'm sure Bojan and Jelena here can speak until tomorrow about the pains of getting money from EU, and even more from spending it and waiting for EU to pay you back, because one of the challenges with EU is that you have to pre-fund. So you are covering the cost of activities and you receive 20 or 30% of the funding only after the whole project has been completed and the reports has been adopted, which puts a challenge to the liquidity of organization or the cash flow. And not to mention that for the bigger the money you get, the more administrative procedures are required, and also so-called co-funding. So you need to secure other sources to match their funds. Government funding is almost non-existent in Serbia, or it is captured as the political process. So yes, you can receive it if you are going to, stand behind them in pictures and legitimize their policy and not be a watchdog. In the past, we had one happy exemption with independent oversight bodies. So BCSP has received funds from Anti-Corruption Agency for our research on risks of corruption in police. And that was at the open call in very transparent process. Similarly, we received funding from Ombudsperson Office for doing expert analysis on how to regulate human rights in police. But this was a very short period of time until political situation deteriorated. I've already covered private sector consultancy work. We had for 5 or 6 years a major consultancy work as implementers for a Swedish assistance to Serbian police. We've tried to commercialize some of our services, like selling publications, but that really didn't work. And we didn't have any experience with crowdfunding or collecting the support from individual donors, citizens, and so on. But it is becoming more and more popular among our peers in civil society, especially in a closed political environment. So these are all examples and kind of questions you should ask yourself for your organization. What is the environment? What are the opportunities and limitations in funding and policy environment that will influence your funding combination and funding sources? What I would, I will skip this. You will see just the different percentages of different sources of funding. And this is, for example, information that is shared with the board in BCSP and with our assembly. And this was, I think, the most successful year of our income when we had 9% of our income from commercial service. But it's very difficult to be repeated. What I want to focus on now is, or maybe ask you, so how would you describe what is a good funding? How would you know what is successful funding model of an organization?
Hi, Sophie here. From the EPC, but the one in Brussels, I'm not sure if it was mentioned before, but I think from our perspective, it's definitely the diversification that makes it sustainable. So to make sure that we have different funding, so different donors, that it's also different sectors. So we have a membership base that works quite well, plus foundations and then EU money, and that kind of diversification helps to make sure that it's quite sustainable for a long time.
Thank you, Sophie. I see Eduardo has also raised a hand. So diversification, getting it from different types of donors and different sources. Yes, Eduardo?
Yes, and also thinking about knowing that this the sources of funding goes from just beyond 1 year. I mean, we have at least a medium-term possibility to get funds. Even if you have diversification, how long will this last from each of the at least the most important ones?
Yes, brilliant. This is very important. Longevity, or the longer the funds you can get, that creates more stability for the organization. Because as my colleague from Sarajevo has once illustrated at this meeting of directors of think tanks, we were all running, as an animal in a circus on this circle, another application, another report, another program, and never a time to stop and do a kind of core work. So any opportunity to get at least 2, 3, I haven't heard of 5 years funds in my life, although we had a chance to get 2, 3 cycle funds from the same donor, but the longer the funding, the better. Ma, you were the next, yes?
Yeah, so in addition to the diversity and the, multiple year projects that was raised, I also think projects that, occur, maybe every 2 years, or so how sometimes you do a project this year and then in 2 years, that same project, like an updated version of the project is required. So getting projects like that kind of secures funding.
Yes, thank you very much. That's super important if it is predictable, if you can build a relationship, so to have a continuity in your topic and in your mission. So we had a team with brilliant ideas, and sometimes we invested in piloting a new thing and decided to drop it out, but what was worth the best case was when we would pilot something with a small money experiment and then be able to build on it and continue engaging on this topic. And there are very few donors that are happy to engage and support you on the same topic all over again. One that comes to my mind is, for example, National Endowment for Democracy. They are very picky when choosing a partner, but once they get a trust in you, they prefer selecting the same partners all over again. While other donors make a point of not supporting the same organizations all over, but if you have built a good relationship, they might recommend you to another donor, so you might be able to link up the support. So for example, we use the support from Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to build our expertise on EU matters, so to be able to get the EU funds for the same activity on a larger scale later on. Any other elements of success? So colleagues have said diversification, long-term reliability, and there is a fourth thing I would add, and this is reserves, the most difficult part. How to make reserves when we are non-profits. We are not supposed to have a profit at the end of year. We are not supposed to have a surplus left, but everything spent on programs for which we got support. So it's a very challenging task, but it's very important. If you cannot get a core funding or institutional funding, which would give you this flexibility, then the only way is to commercialize some of the services and earn reserves, make reserves, or earn them through endowment, as Donia has mentioned. So invest the money and earn from interest rates and having that money there. But it is one of the most challenging tasks, I would say, for nonprofits to make a legal reserves that would be there for unexpected costs, for investment, for rainy days. Maria, please.
Hi, Sonja. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm actually finding all this is obviously very useful, but what I'm kind of lost is because I'm working in a country like Uruguay, and it's not very known to many people. So I'll just say very quickly that it's a country which has been listed at as a developed country in the World Bank's international list and what have you. And so over the last several years, we've had, obviously funding is a big challenge. We're also, we're also a small country which has very little impact or cannot connect, for example, regionally to other countries like, our neighbors like Argentina or Brazil are super huge. Other countries like Chile, Paraguay, Colombia, they have a lot more to offer in terms of the content as well. So I think funding is a big challenge, and that leaves us with only the option of getting private funding, more corporate funding, and the thing is that that means that the kind of research that the organization then pursues is of very elite interests, because you're trying to do that, and how do you actually settle with work that a research think tank should be doing about public policy that impacts everybody. So I'm kind of, my own background is working with the World Bank, with the UN, with donors, international organizations and institutions. And so it's a very hard fit, and I'm struggling really to understand what would be, while we are following a business model, I just don't see how we're actually being true to our essence of being a think tank while depending on such funding opportunities. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Maria, for putting this quite interesting and demanding challenge in front of all of us. I hope not just me. What I would say is look outside of Uruguay, if possible. That was one of the strategies we've deployed once we realized that because of political pressure, we would probably not get support by government or engagement that was required for support from other donors. So what we did then was to apply for the regional grants, which were larger, longer, that put pressure on staff and organization in a sense of managing the networks, but that allows us to skip the scale and influence the same policy at home, but through a collaborative project. So I don't know from the top of my head, but I'm sure that there would be opportunities either within Latin America or globally if you would join a community or a network in a topic that is of your interest. Another source of funding that was very good for us was EU academic research funding, so-called Horizons. That's very difficult to get, and you need to marry well in a consortium of a number of institutions. But it's very nice because it's usually a few years' time, and you have program costs just for research, and indirect costs you don't have to justify. And in many cases, actually, if you go to the websites of EU research funding, you can fill the profile, and European based institutes and think tanks will be looking for partners, because the geography is also one of criteria for awarding projects. So if the project is dealing, I don't know, with, for example, global development goals, it's more likely that consortium having a partner from each continent will get support. So if you are the Latin American partner, even if it's not the biggest state in your region that you are representing, you might get funding through this kind of sources. So I'm just thinking from the top of my head, but sometimes we need to look out of our box to get more of a funds. Anyone else in relation to what we've discussed? Or Maria's challenge? Okay, this slide is just about, the main point is that we need to think of the costs of any funding. We have already discussed, I think Donia has mentioned the dependence and perception of different funding, but it's also important to think of the costs of running or using certain funds, of how much you need to invest, for example, in writing an application, in maintaining, implementing this grant, and how much burden it is on a team. And I must admit, I've made a lot of mistakes in this regard, and there are many things that we improved based on making mistake first and then improving the practice. And I'm going to share some of these mistakes with you in a minute. But before that, I would wanna make a very brief break, if you agree, and show you a video and ask you to tell me how familiar it sounds to you and what could we do about it. Please first let me know if you can hear a sound. Just a second. Do you hear the sound? Good.
Have a great day. Hi. What can I do for you today, sir?
Hi, my name is John. I appreciate what you do for this neighborhood. Your pizza is making a difference.
Well, thank you, John. You know, when we opened, we were just a small shop with a simple mission to...
Right. Listen, I represent a large institution, and we're interested in buying a significant number of their pizzas.
Oh, okay, great. Well, our cheese pizzas are $10.
Great.
And then...
I've done some number crunching and determined that we're going to need 10 per month, and I can pay $8 per pie. Oh, and I'll need them to be Sicilian.
Oh, but the Sicilian pies are more expensive. That won't cover my cost.
Oh, I'm sure you can just find someone who will be willing to make up the difference.
Who?
Well, maybe do a couple black tie events, you know, honor some people.
I'm concerned about the impact on quality at that price. And, you know, my reputation is at stake.
Of course, but just imagine how much more efficient you would be with 20% less than what you should be given. But I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of other pizza places around here. I mean, it's too much work.
It's okay. You know what? I've got an oven that's been on the fritz, and maybe the steady business will help pay for repairs.
Oh, I would love to help with that, but 100% of what we give to you must be spent on ingredients, okay? We do not pay for overhead, okay? See, none of this money can be used for utilities, rent, marketing, pizza boxes, or your salary. Especially not your salary. No.
No pizza boxes? And how am I supposed to deliver them?
Oh, well, there's a place in Bushwick that is completely sustainable. They deliver your pizza using solar-powered drones on recycle bins.
I don't have those.
Okay. You can spend 5% on pizza boxes, 10% on dough, 5% on tomatoes, 10% on cheese, and the rest on spices. See, it's all spelled out here in this pizza-making plan.
I'm the one who knows how to make the pizzas.
Yeah, no, of course. What you want to do is just fill out this paperwork, okay? You make any of the stipulated adjustments to your business model, and then after a few site visits and several audits, payments should start rolling in about 6 to 9 months.
A site visit?
Yeah. As you see here on page 47, okay, your chef will either have to have been nominated for a James Beard Award, competed on Iron Chef, or taken anger management classes from Gordon Ramsay.
I serve pizzas. A James Beard Award, huh? Most of my cooks can't even grow a beard.
Okay, you have a link so you can see the whole video after the session, but anyone found it familiar of your experience?
I think we all sign maybe like contractual agreements with them, so you have to maybe accept maybe the terms and conditions for the funds you're about to receive. I think I remember an experience at where I work. There was a funding we got from, I can't remember the organization, but we were not expected to use it for maybe any other activity outside training staff. So at the end of the day, we were forced to go for trainings like as opposed to maybe just refunding the money, because if we didn't make use of it prior to the end of when the project was supposed to expire, then you refund the money. And that money would have been put to better use, maybe for software, maybe purchase or other pressing needs, but it went to trainings that maybe we really didn't need at the time.
Mm-hmm. So one approach is to accept it as it is. The other is to try to package with what they ask. Any other ideas? What can you do? I think one of the most difficult tasks in a think tank is to prepare a good budget. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the lessons I've learned through mistake is that growth is not good if the budget structure is not good. So if you remember that first table that I showed, we were really growing until 2016, but the budget structure was not good because the division going to our core costs, the running costs, the basic costs of organization was the same. The amount was the same, while the program costs, the activities that we were doing were increasing, which means we were doing more with the same amount of resources, and that overstretched the staff. And we realized that the growth was not followed by the growth within the organization. So I think the structure of how you divide funds is very important. The other mistake that we made was, and that was in response to the environment, was we invested a lot in a partnership projects, in big collaborations to be able to get these longer, bigger funds. But that put a lot of pressure on managing and being responsible for the funds that would go to partners. So as you can see, in 2014, almost half of our budget was just going through our account and being distributed to our partners in a region. But still, the BCSP finance staff was the one that had to review all the paperwork after our colleagues and to prepare it for the external audit. And it's only later that we managed to decrease this and to work on other types of engagement with partners, so not to take this much of the burden. But the both points are in relation to the budget structure and why we need to take care of it. And these are the four categories of the budget that I think are important. If you are starting a think tank, you first need to think, what is your core organizational budget? Many of us have started from concrete projects, and many organizations did not grow because they only kept thinking about the projects and didn't think of how to use the projects to create professional capacity in an organization. So the example I gave about creating, for example, a communications officer post that supports the researchers. So it's important to know what are your basic costs to run an organization. Do you need an office, or you can work without office? Will you have a full-time researchers, or will you have an external associate? So what's your business model? So to know what are the costs that you will be looking for. Then the program costs, and then what is the privilege and rarely being able to have. But it's very important is if you can think of capacity building and investment costs or lines in your budget. Sometimes if you have an institutional funding, you can clearly put it there. But if you don't, then my advice would be to use the project funding, parts of it, to build your own capacity. So for example, we were doing projects on monitoring public procurement in defense. And parts of activities were initially to train ourselves on public procurement process before we did the analysis. So investing in capacity to be able to do this work. And reserve or contingency funding, which is very difficult to get, but very important. EU sometimes allows contingency funding, but to a small extent, and it's only to project related. I won't go through this, how you do a budget, because I put a resource in a presentation that you can look at. But I want to share another mistake, and this is that it's the most difficult from my experiences to monitor the budget, because mostly we are focused on planning the budget, fundraising, and accounting for the costs that were made. While it is difficult to find additional time to do different types of overviews that are good to check the health of organization, but also to be used for proper planning. So in my case, we've gotten information on how much we spent each year and what are our typical costs, which was very good for developing a budget for next year. But we were very late to actually see, for example, how much money from which project has went and how much money is left. And this is one of the challenges, I'll skip this, that is especially highlighted during the crisis, but also in a so-called peaceful times. And many of nonprofits have this challenge of liquidity. And this is that even if you are successful and you get a lot of funds because of the donors' calendars, because you need to fund the activities they support before they give you funds, you're borrowing from one project, spending it on another project until you get funds. And meanwhile, you can get in a problem with whether you'll have enough cash to cover all the lines. Also, sometimes you have one activity and a number of staff, but there are no new applications in this area and you need to bridge over a period. So there are many ways why liquidity can be a challenge, and that's why the monitoring of the budget is very important. And these are the worst case scenario recommendations of what to do if your liquidity is in problem. So either by asking funders to give you money in advance or delaying some of the non-essential payment, or getting a loan, which is quite risky. And we are ending with the crisis. As I've said, I don't want to talk only about the potential of decreasing funds, but also polarization and difficult political environment. And these are the 5 steps which might be helpful thinking of a crisis. So one of the worst case scenarios is first to calculate how much longer would you be able to run the organization if you don't receive any new funds. So to try to make a worst case scenario, to know what's your time frame for getting a new funds. Then a gray scenario is to sit and see where you could maybe ask for reallocations or approach new donors, where you could actually get new opportunities in the time of crisis. And as we heard from a colleague from Italy, crisis is not just a threat, it might be an opportunity. So we all know that there was a lot of demand for anything to do with COVID in response to the latest crisis. Then there is scenario 3, and this is if you are made to do a cut, to use this matrix. I don't know if you've seen it before, but to run your programs and plans through this matrix of profitability and impact. So not to look only what costs you the most or what gets you the most funding, but also what makes the biggest impact. Because you might get, to keep the project or program which brings a lot of money, but it's not bringing an impact in an area where you want to make an impact. And in the long term, it might, put you in a risk that after a year or two, you're left without additional funding. And the last thing, I won't go into details again about this. There is a whole text you can read after the session. But very important thing is to communicate this beyond just the board and director post. Because in a time of crisis, I think everybody is afraid. And we have in 2015, when we ended the first institutional grant, we had a situation where over the course of a few months, we needed to decrease the costs. And we've decided, for example, to decrease the costs not by letting someone go, but by cutting the salary of everyone in a team for 10% from the top to the bottom. And that might be a good situation because it was communicated and there was solidarity in the team, but it had an impact midterm that some people left because they were dissatisfied with this lower salary. So there is always a kind of pro and contra in these difficult situations, but it's very important that it's transparently communicated and that there are no rumors about it, and not just to the team, but also to the donors. This is my experience as a director, that actually donors want to discuss not only successes, but also challenges. They appreciate being honest with them and sharing them with them challenges, especially if you share with them also the way how they can help you out in this regard. I would stop here. If you have any question for me, I have offered for you, I know there is no time, but for possibly a study group working on finance, these are the 4 things that I thought were particularly difficult and useful to know. And this is to think of how to cost the project well. So how to negotiate with this demanding pizza buyer guy in a way that wouldn't kill your organization, that would make you create an impact and do what you want, but still fulfill the conditions of the crazy pizza buyer. So how do you do costing well? The other topic is the one that I mentioned a number of times, and this is how you make a legal reserves. So what could be done to make reserves? What types of sources are there for, and what kind of work could think tanks do? The third thing, which I would recommend to discuss with researchers also, is we should not only follow the donor's request, we can create donors where they don't exist. And we have done it in the past. So how you put the topic you want to deal with on agenda, also on donors' agenda, and nurture a relationship so that the donors would invest in a program you have created, but they have never thought of before. And the last one is, if you were a director, who would you want to have involved in this kind of discussions, whether it's only finance people, or would you involve also research people, or would you have a specialized post of fundraiser? How would you divide the roles to address these issues? So I'll stop here and just show you the resources I've planned, and you can ask if you have any last questions or comments.